how did you come to theatre, and what was the reason for choosing it as a profession?
Well, I have a feeling that the profession chose me than I chose the profession. It was actually by accident. I wanted to be an architect. I was really passionate about architecture, and I still am very attracted to that. But for some reasons I was not allowed to take it up, even though I was selected in the School of Planning and Architecture for the course. So I was very sulky at that point, not knowing what to do. And so as usual, you take up something neutral, when you can't decide what to do. So I took up English Honours and Miranda, and was very unhappy. I really didn't enjoy that. The primary thing about that was that I just kept feeling all the time that it just doesn't connect to my life, and it's not something I'm passionate about. Why am I doing this? Also, the whole method of education bothered me, that the whole focus was on going and reading critics, and then making notes, and then probably just spilling out whatever you had read from them. It just didn't enthuse me at all. It didn't inspire me at all. So after I'd finished my BA, I decided that I'm not pursuing an MA. But I didn't know what do I want to do, because not being able to do architecture, I had nothing else in mind. And that's when the possibility, because I had an environment of arts at home, with my sister learning from Hafiz Ali Khan, Amjad's father, my other sister learning from Birju Maharaj, and sort of a kind of full-time thing. My parents both in theatre, so you can imagine what the whole scene was like. So there was this NSD interview where my father suggested, and I was quite horrified, I'm too shy on stage. And I said, I'll make a fool of myself, I don't want to do that. And he says, since you don't want to join, there's no harm. And I made the mistake or whatever to go for that audition, got selected, and in the absence of anything else to do, joined it. And then, of course, sort of the drama school was a major shifting point for me. And I always say this, that it's more than the theatre aspect of it. It was the method of education at drama school, where everything made a connect to you, or rather you were forced to make a connect. That you have to find an interpretation, you have to find a reason, you have to have a critique of whatever you're reading, and why you like it, and what you don't like about it, how does it connect to you. That immediately, sort of whatever we were doing had acquired a different meaning. So at that point, two things I think triggered in me. One was that a very strong critique of the education system kept coming to me, that it really needs to change. Because I saw how I changed in those 3 years, the kind of confidence that training gave me, the kind of initiative you learn to take, and the kind of maturity of having to make choices for yourself, to make decisions, that it really helped. So that was one thing, that was one trigger. The other, of course, was a kind of developing a passion for theatre, and the creativity, the imagination, and the power of the imagination you really start understanding. So to me, I think that was a turning point in my life for several reasons. And so that was the beginning. That's how I got into theatre.
From being a student at NSD, you have travelled to directorship of NSD, and you have even worked on the pedagogic aspect of theatre making at NSD itself.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about what this theatre in education program was about, and what you had in mind, and how far do you think it still holds?
Yeah. Now, the two aspects to the pedagogic aspect. One is to do with the training at the NSD itself. And as I told you, that when sort of we got trained by Mr. Al-Qazi, and which was a very exacting kind of process where he insisted on research, where he insisted on, sort of detailed finding out of everything, and followed primarily the kind of Stanislavskian method, the method acting format. So it was essentially influenced by the Western methodologies of acting. But because it was a new school, there were not many trained teachers who could teach. So some of our departments, sort of which handle the essential disciplines of theatre, were not very strong. There was no clear methodology. So students learnt mostly from Al-Qazi when the practice aspects went, because he was the one doing most of the productions. We had other people like Shanta Gandhi and others who did very good productions, largely before Mr. Al-Qazi came, but one or two even after he came. And if we had got an idea of their methodology as well, it would have probably enriched us more. But what we learned was to be very thorough and very professional about every aspect of theatre. No deviation was allowed at all. And that was something which was very valuable, that kind of discipline. But when, and then when Mr. Al-Qazi went, Mr. Karanth came to drama school, and there was a complete shift of the vision of drama school where it became more indigenized. He tried to do that, and he also tried to make a connect with the rest of the country. The traditions, the languages of expression in theatre in different parts of the country. He tried to bring it into the mainstream so that at least the students are aware of the variety that is India, of the multi-levels that exist in India. What it also did is suddenly, before that we were only aware that there is this method, what we learned from Mr. Al-Qazi, because that was the only method we could see. But with him turning it around, we suddenly became conscious that there are other methods possible. So the questioning became, sort of possible. We could think of alternatives. We could think of other ways of approaching a text, other ways of direction, other languages of production. So I would say that was a major turning point also, when Mr. Karanth came. So apart from the fact that he put in motion a different kind of methodology, etc. I think what he also did was help us realize the possibility of different languages. So I think it's around that time that in the country also, the emergence of women directors in the north particularly, where sort of the younger people, not younger really, but let's say my age, a lot of women started coming in and working with a great deal of confidence in a language which was very different from the prevailing language. So we keep wondering that why did it happen at that time, the 80s. Now, while I'm talking to you, I realize that this could have been one of the triggers, that we suddenly thought that it was possible to question a methodology, that it was possible to have an alternate methodology. So different people started trying and coming into the foreground. And it was not just the methodology, but the whole process approach was very different. So a new language started coming into being, not just in women directors' work, even other works. Because what Mr. Karanth also did was bring in different people to work with the students. So he saw to it that directors from the south, from the north, from the west, everywhere they would come and the students would have an exposure to different styles, which was not the case earlier. So that was fairly single focused. It had its advantages that you knew at least one methodology very thoroughly. But now the advantage was that you had an exposure to a wide world, but then you mastered almost none. But this now gave us a kind of sense of what we need today in India, because this started a debate of modernity versus tradition, and a series of other debates, and what is modern, and we don't believe in tradition, and that it is a revivalist mode trying to go back to tradition. All these questions were thrown up. There was a huge debate, and in the midst of all this, theatre was really growing in leaps and bounds all over the world. So there is the postmodernist theatre, there is the post-dramatic theatre, and there's the whole works. And here we were stuck in a very basic dialogue about the method acting and the traditional acting, and sort of how to really come out of that. This was compounded by the whole debate around the Sangeet Natak Academy scheme of giving grants to young people. Some very exciting works emerged in the process, which we all tend to forget, but somebody like Ratan Thyam, his Chakravyuh, or Bansi or Bhanu, I mean, their work really came up at that time. So that was a very exciting phase. Now it's, so as one was watching all this, one kept feeling that, the school is not being able to keep pace with, having brought in the indigenous aspects. Now the training was quite interesting. It became a combination of the method acting and of various skills from different parts of the region. So Karanji would bring different kind of movement languages. So we would have Thangta, and we would have Kalari, and we would have, the works. He would bring in different music traditions from different parts of the country. He would take the students out to the region to actually observe these traditional forms in their own context, to really understand the dynamics and how it was so organic and part of their lives. All these were very useful and exercises towards making them understand or get them more grounded. But subsequently you started feeling that we need to have a kind of acting training which you can find a kind of uniformity, step by step what is happening, what should happen next. This was too mixed up, it was too random, that anybody could come in for any input at any time, and one didn't know how it has to really grow. So it just so happens that by the time I became director, it also coterminous with Vijayabai being the chairperson, and both of us were interested. She was also questioning that what is really being taught at the drama school, and it was vague in my mind, but I just kept feeling that what is happening at the NSD at this point is not sufficient, it is not satisfactory, and that we need to evolve a system, and that it will come from more modern trends that are happening, but with people who are also grounded. They understand what Indian tradition and Indian body is all about. So became a search for trying to revise the syllabus, and it was very hectic one year when we decided to give a 0 year in the school and work on evolving a syllabus. I think we talked to a lot, sort of people all over the country, practitioners, and then finally evolved a new syllabus, brought in new people to handle that, to make it more rigorous, number one, to make it more contemporary, and yet to keep in mind that here is a school in India which is then, trying to bring in the richness and the variety that Indian tradition holds. So that was one exercise in pedagogy that I was involved with when we evolved a new syllabus in 89-90. And then put it into practice. I think that is the one that is still operative at the NSD with some minor variations. The other exercise in pedagogy was a kind of fallout of my own experience of dissatisfaction with education and how it doesn't relate to people's lives, which is when I thought that theatre and education needs to be pushed, particularly for the education at the school level, for children, young people. And that's when we started, and I had no idea what this methodology is about, how to put it into practice, what is its pedagogy. But I knew that there needs to be a connect, and theatre is a very good tool for doing it because it had helped me. I was very sure that it will help others. So we thought that let's begin by starting an adult, this was an idea that Karanji had floated long back, to have an adult repertory performing for children. So we picked that up again. Then somehow it went into cold storage, it didn't take off. But then we picked it up again and thought that let's make a company which has adults who are interested in education, interested in theatre, and then work for children. And since at that point we could find only one person in the country who had actually had training or understood or had worked in the field of theatre and education was Barry. So Barry was asked to direct, become the director of that team, and that's how, you know, the theatre and education wing of the drama school started. So initially it was just doing productions for children, but around concerns of children. So it would be about, you know, sort of their frustrations in the family or the school, or how they perceive environment and how they would wish the environment to change. So stories which would help children to think about environment and things like that. So initially it was these people preparing that and trying to read up on this methodology, and it continued like that. Then we also started the summer theatre workshops for children, which was partly as a training to these people who were working, that they need to know how to work with children, how children think, you know, how they respond, so that, you know, it's a better understanding. When the TI company was formed, actually I had imagined, or I had, let's say, dreamt, that, you know, it'll develop in a direction where it'll be able to make an active connect with the education system, where it'll be able to intervene, and because it was for all to see that it plays a very important part in personality development and confidence building, in teamwork, in sensitizing, in relationships, in making responsible young citizens, you know, sort of, they learn to make choices, they learn to take decisions. So, so that was one aspect of it, personality building. The other aspect was how to make education really meaningful, how to make it connect to your life, how to make it experiential, so that you carry it with you through your life. It's not a chapter that I've read and I forget and it never comes to any use at the end of it. So, and theatre can do that, because it can immerse you into the whole process of discovery, of actually experiencing what that means. So, all this, of course, you know, sort of I have worked now, because the TIE company, being part of the National School of Drama, was definitely had to focus more on the performance aspect, and therefore, you know, performing for children and doing the summer workshops so that the artists who were working in the company would understand children better. So after I have left drama school, I'm also trying to develop the methodology for active intervention into education, which is a very complex process. People seem to perceive that it's all about enactment of a lesson. It isn't. It is to be able to teach your subject in a way that children are led into a journey of discovery about what that lesson is about. And it can be a very extremely empowering methodology for teachers. It would also, I think, take away the drudgery from the kind of routine teaching that you have to do every day, because it necessarily requires imagination. It necessarily requires a new kind of look at things, because when children come with their inputs, you know, the whole meaning changes. And how in a society like today, which is becoming more and more divided, I think theatre can play such an important role in making us sensitive about each other, about the differences, and yet how we need to understand and how we need to empathize. So it brings in empathy, it brings a better understanding of relationships and everything, along with understanding the lesson that you are learning, so that it becomes, you know, the child in this process invests in the learning itself. The child, because, you know, it's his answers, it's his decisions that, you know, the teacher is pushing him to make. So the teacher's role is not of telling him or her anything, but of putting him, her in situations where they will find the answers. And once they find the answers, they feel that, you know, it's their lesson, you know, it's about them. So it's a process which is extremely exciting and has tremendous potential. I genuinely believe that if we were able to find a method of, you know, sort of incorporating it, if not all schools, but even in a cluster of schools, and see the result, I think it'll be a kind of revolution in education itself. And it's not difficult. You know, all the hurdles about time and space and things, we have worked it out that really they don't come in the way. You can actually finish the courses made. And so that's what I'm pursuing at the moment, trying to follow it up. Big problem, because as a private organization, difficult to interact, or difficult for organizations, educational institutions to collaborate with us, particularly the government organizations. Because they have their own accountability, but that's also the area where we want to intervene, because government schools is where these interventions are more required, and that used to be the dream of my mother, of reaching out to the underprivileged. So that's what we try to do, but hopefully we'll make some inroads.
Now coming to your directorial work, you have worked on women issues a lot, about violence on women, role of women in society, like your plays like Suchetana, Aur Kitne Tukre, Baghdad Burning. So would you tell us why, I mean, I know why it is so important for you to talk about these issues out in a theatre platform, but would you just share your thoughts and your experience about these plays, and tell us how I mean, partition has always, I think, have haunted you, and the theme is there in the plays. So would you talk about it?
See, one that I'm not very sure whether I have consciously selected plays on women's issues. My process has been largely to do with, I think there is a kind of legacy of my parents of having been very politically conscious, and with a kind of liberal left orientation. I think that's part of one's consciousness. But so keeping that in mind, sort of whatever is happening in society, you are reflecting on it, and there are certain things which disturb you a great deal, and it is around that one starts weaving the theme that you want to work on. So for instance, at a given point in time, if you are noticing that what we call modern India, and where we as women are living a very privileged life, where we can choose what we want to do, there is 90% of the women who are leading, even women like us in a city like Delhi, they're leading lives which are highly pressured. They're not able to make a single choice about their lives. They're having to work, they're having to do the work at home, they're getting beaten up, anything is happening. And that really used to, every time I used to encounter somebody like that, and I used to wonder, where are we living? And what about, then when I was reading Subarnlata, I thought, one can't imagine that was the cradle of the national reform movement. And at the same time, when this reform movement was at its peak, this is the life of, Subarnlata. So the kind of contradictions, the hypocrisy of this society, the whole thing really hits you. And because that novel really moved me when I read it, and it kind of resonated, because I knew a lot of cases where things like this were happening to people like me, people around me from my class and my setup. And I thought we need to present this, that this is the trajectory, nothing has changed. So it was out of that, at that point in time, that was my concern. In the case of partition, again, it didn't begin with the whole issue of women. For me, the thing was about why the silence around partition, why don't we talk about it, particularly in performing arts. So the question was really that. It's just that, sort of once I read Urvashi's book, it kind of formed, sort of greater clarity emerged as to what are the cultural reasons why there is this silence around partition. And that book attracted me for the kind of interviews that it had and the kind of sensitivity around lives of those people who were actual survivors. And we got interested in working around it. But having got interested and having started research on partition, the material I collected was so humongous, I didn't know where to start and where to end. And it just continued, because once people knew that this is what I was interested in, sort of new stories kept coming every day, new perspectives, new answers to questions. And I got completely confused that this is not going to work. This is a Pandora's box. And then I decided to create a focus. That Urvashi's book also has lots of interviews, not just with women. But then I decided that, the stories that are attracting us are the women's stories. So let's then just focus on women. So that was the first focus. So remove all other stories. Then the second thing, and that was to do with a very contemporary reality around us, was that, every time I used to drive from here to school, there were these placards on the way on every electric pole, Sri Ka Samman, Rashtra Ka Samman. And this whole business of honor and the rhetoric around it really, really irritated me. That what are we talking about, and why is the woman going to bear the brunt of this whole business of honor? And that's when I decided that, okay, because this whole question of honor was so central to the whole partition women's narrative particularly. So decided on that. And then the choice of stories had to further narrow down, because honor was the narrative almost in every story, of the question of choices. Because one of the major things was that the women were given choices, at that point. So what were they really choices? So it was not to do actually with women's issues. It was to do with this idea of honor and the idea of choice and the idea of how women's body becomes the site. So, I would look at it more like a partition narrative rather than talking about women's issues per se. But yes, because we were talking of the whole idea of honor and choice, it did tend to focus. But I don't think there's any other play that I have done which is around women. But it is to do with a kind of political reality, and it crystallizes at a given point. For instance, I was very, 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 very disturbed about the Iraq War, the first Iraq War. But then, you're worried, like we are very worried about what's happening today, but I'm not yet doing a play about it. So this kept on happening in my mind. I was reading a lot of material, I was reading stories, fiction, all kinds of things. And then just happened that I happened to go to Afghanistan for a festival, theatre festival. And that is where, the havoc that these wars have created in people's lives kind of hit me in a very, very strange way. First time in my life, I actually felt scared stepping out on the street. First time in my life, I thought that I should cover myself so well that nobody sees me. I was just not used to the sensation at all of wanting to become invisible. And that's when I felt I have to do something. And it was not about being a woman, but it was about being in a war-torn society, and what it does to psyche, and how people cope day to day with that. So it was after coming back from there that I took up Baghdad Burning, and luckily I happened to, happened to see this blog which was so brilliant, that in a very unsentimental way it kind of presented the political situation and the daily lives of the Iraqis. So it was a kind of an anti-war play, I would say, or anti-occupation play. So these choices have been governed by that. Then I had been telling Gitanjali, who has done scripts for some of my plays, that I have been wanting to do a play about these, divide that is being created in society. And because I'd read a novel of hers which I really liked, this Hamara Sheher Us Baras, but I was telling her that I didn't want to do that. I had some little other focus in mind, that this is how I'd like to do it, but she didn't get the time to write. And so finally I said, okay, then I'm working on this novel, because I really liked it, how very imperceptibly differences come in people's lives. And I had seen it in my own life, how it was happening, of people changing very imperceptibly, actually extremely secular, liberal people. So being forced to change almost. So I felt it's quite essential to do that, how we are tearing apart the fabric of our society, that we need to do a play like that. So it was governed by that. So it has been largely, I would say, politically motivated, or not even politically motivated. I think things that bother me, that impact on me, that I want to really talk about. So when somebody asks me, what do you want to do now? It's very tough. I mean, I remember now, I haven't done anything for a long time. I had wanted, after that Nirbhaya episode, I'd wanted to do something about women, but it was a real dilemma, because it was an episode that really shook me, or shook everybody so much, that I felt that doing anything has the danger of trivializing it. And therefore couldn't find a format which would deal with the problem in all its gravity, and yet retain its privacy or dignity or whatever. Kept asking Gitanjali that let's work on a script, didn't get the time, she didn't get the time. Then I started wanting to work on what's happening now. Basically Kashmir has been bothering me a lot, what's happening in Kashmir, but again now the self-censorship is an operation, that I'm wondering whether to make the effort to do a play which can't be staged. So I'm trying to think of methods of putting across the ideas that bother me about what's happening there. So it's, I would say that largely the impulse is political. When I think about it myself, that what really gets me all worked up and bothered is largely political things that are happening around us. Because it is a very troubled time that we are living in. And the changes that are happening are really going to have a very long-term impact, and that's bothersome. But having talked of the subjects, what is very exciting is the kind of change in language that I saw in women's work. And initially, even we, when I went to see, let's say, Anamika's play or Anuradha's play or Maya's play, there was a sense that, I'm not fully understanding what's happening. So obviously there was a change in the language, but because I was interested, I would try to find out that what were you trying to do, and immediately you could see that there is a paradigm shift. There is a paradigm shift in the sense that, one, it is just much more collaborative work where multiple voices are finding their space in the performance. And once there are multiple voices, it's not going to be a linear narrative, it's going to be a diffused narrative, but a much more exciting narrative of saying several things, several interpretations at the same time. The second thing that I found was that it was much more subjective and passionate. So it was finding expression in abstraction. I mean, the language that was emerging was much more abstract, like poetry. It was a language of images. It was a language which really bared the inner world, which physicalized the inner world. And that was very exciting, and that, set you questioning about why is this happening in their work more than in others. And I don't know if that's the right explanation, but I just felt that maybe down centuries, women have been used to keeping, everything within themselves, not really articulating it to the world outside. So the inner world is very complex, rich, maybe even confused, and it is that which is finding an expression in a visual language, and that makes it very, very different and very, apart from complex, very exciting. And they're trying to find different visual languages, different modes of expression to give expression to this multiple inner reality. So people say that they're confused, they don't know what they're saying, समझ में नहीं आ रहा, इतनी सब चीज़ें साथ में हो रही हैं. It is because इतनी सब चीज़ें साथ में होती हैं. It's just that people didn't project that. But then hoti hain, and here it's also an attempt to show that life is so what should I say, sort of full of multiple realities. Also, a woman's life is much more that, she's operating at multiple levels at the same time. So, and that's out of habit. I mean, sort of you're trained inadvertently to handle, multiple levels of things at the same time. So all this is finding expression in their work. So something which at the initial level was just not finding acceptance. People felt they don't know. But when you talk to them, they said that this was deliberate. A diffused narrative was deliberate. There is no one answer to anything. There is no one climax to a situation. It just, So the attempt was to present a diffused narrative. The attempt was to involve the audience in this game of imagination, give and take. And the attempt was to find a collaborative method of working. So the whole process of preparing a production was undergoing a change, where more space was being given to all the parties involved in the process, and therefore the multiple perspectives. So now this was a very exciting phase when all this work was coming up, whether it was Neelam or Amal or Anuradha or Anamika or Vinapani, sort of these people, and then the younger generation was also kind of taking up. And we have really found some exciting productions coming out of this. Today, however, when you look at the scene, barring some youngsters from different regions, the productions are again becoming very linear, conservative, conventional, and there is just no growth, in my view, of the language. And for some strange reason, what is being glorified is that let us do theatre which reaches the common man. Of course, so that's a very good idea, but not if it forces you to just toe the line. Because theatre is a live medium. It has to respond to the changing life reality, the changing technology, the changing way of thinking, the changing images. How can it remain the same? How can its structure remain the same? It's just not possible. After all, from a realistic, it changed to absurd. Why did it change? But here we tend to run down anything that's trying to change it in the name of the audience. So that is something slightly worrying. I'm hoping that it's only short-lived and an aberration. But at the same time, I must say that there are younger people who are finding very energetic ideas and very energetic languages to say what they want to say. So they are the hope, of changing the theatre language, which can be so exciting. And also recognizing that today theatre faces the challenge of actually competing with something like films and the television and the internet and the media. And what it has as a plus is that it's live. And therefore it has an immediate connect with its audience, and it has to play on that. It has to play more and more on that. I mean, something very preliminary that Badal Sarkar realized in his work has to be developed now. I mean, that was okay at that point in time, but the engagement with the audience has to be much more intense and much more playful. Sort of Badal Sarkar tended to become very serious and grim about it, but the way of engaging has to be more youthful, more energetic, more lively, where you actually engage them, where they actually have to participate, and they actually sort of feel a part of that whole process. So I sometimes, because I'm these days working on process drama or theatre in education, and I'm interested in theatre, I feel maybe process drama has a lot of methods which make it participatory. And maybe participatory theatre is one kind of direction which can link people, because I think people come to theatre with the hope that they can engage actively with the people on stage. And this has a lot of clues there, sort of this method. So I still haven't gathered enough courage to do a production for grown-ups using a participatory method, but probably that's the one thing I'd like to try. Yeah.
About your book that recently came out,
Yeah.
you were talking about Badal Sarkar
Yeah.
and his language of theatre. Do you think that his language of theatre was important? You just said that it was, and it was grounded in that timeless reality and things like that. And it's unfortunate that there hasn't been a progression from his language to further on. Do you think that language is still important today, the language that he tried to develop back then? That stance of his theatre, his getting out of proscenium, or even not really rejecting it because he kept on going back.
Yeah.
People generally think that he rejected complete proscenium, but he didn't.
No, definitely. I mean, I feel that his was a very pioneering role in making us conscious of the limitations of the proscenium, and if theatre had to be kept alive, that it needed to interact. Now that was very important. As I've also mentioned in the book, that I think he somehow, unfortunately, got into his own trap and therefore got stuck at a given point. He couldn't develop his own language, but then it is on others to develop it. And I must say that there are experiments happening where people are trying to engage with the audience, but not enough. I mean, not enough imaginative work has happened in that direction, where you need to work in theatre in a smaller format, with people, with a one-to-one connect, with a kind of, this whole thing of performance art where, performance is perceived to have begun the moment you enter that space, because then you're together in that space, and then what transpires. We have not even begun to start looking at all of that, which has really happened a lot in other places. And there is a lot of potential in our country because as a people, I think improvisation comes naturally to us. Interacting comes naturally to us. And there are spaces where people will not be self-conscious interacting with you because, sort of we're used to it. I remember once I was in England and I had done Haivadan with a group of English students, and we were traveling with it to London. And at the station, I told the Sutradhar, who was our Sutradhar, that why don't you, take this Haivadan figure and at the station, and then just see what happens. I mean, how do people respond, and you can act. But their professor was so horrified. He says, you are not going to do that. So I said, why? It is an extension of what they're going to learn about how we interact, sort of there is a whole improvisatory quality to it, there's a playful quality to it, and they might discover something new about these characters. He just couldn't imagine that how can you even let them loose like that. The children were quite excited, but he didn't let them do it. So he got so frightened because they temperamentally are just not made to openly interact. It takes them so long, even on that Covent Garden thing, somebody's performing and he's asking them for answers. Nobody talks, nobody participates, because it's just so reserved and so shy, which is so different from us, sort of we'll jump into anything, anywhere. So what I'm saying is that it comes naturally to us, but we are not using it. And also that we need to not just stick to, the kind of street theatre format which has become so straight-jacketed in its own way, and it has not been able to get out of its own limitations. So while everybody understands that it is a format which has to attract immediate attention, and it has its own vocabulary, not own vocabulary but own limited set of rules, but within that it has to innovate. You can't be doing work in the same format as it was done in IPTA time, sort of it's just too... IPTA stood out because it was innovative. IPTA stood out because it emphasized quality. Not just anybody could act and not just anything could happen there. So this is not happening today. So, when we do political theatre, we take refuge in the fact that भाई हमें तो अपनी बात पहुंचानी है। बात आप अगर थिएटर कर रहे हो तो स्पीच नहीं दे रहे हो तो थिएटर अच्छा करो ना पहले, तब तो बात पहुंचेगी। सो मतलब डिफरेंटली पहुंचेगी एक लेक्चर से। तो दैट्स नॉट हैपनिंग, and we need to really focus on that and develop it beyond what has happened, and it needs to be more youthful. I personally feel that, you know, sort of it is the younger people who are going to take the society wherever they take it, and it is they therefore who need to get involved.